The seam gave way at the worst possible moment, right there in front of the whole town square, and the laughter that followed sounded like a pack of coyotes finding something wounded. Mercy and Whitfield didn't cry. She'd promised herself years ago that Prescott, Texas, would never see her cry. Not since the men who ran this town had buried her father in a pauper's grave and called it charity. So she stood very still in the dust, one hand pressed flat against the tear at her shoulder, and let them laugh. "Look at her," said Loretta Pruitt, who'd never worked a day past pouring tea, wearing her mother's old rags to the founder's social. As if that means anything. The dress had been good once. Blue calico, faded now to the color of a bruise healing, and it had torn not from carelessness but from 3 years of being let out, taken in, and let out again to fit a body that had done more labor than any dress was built to survive. Mercy and worked the Whitfield claim alone since her mother died of the fever last spring. She hauled water, split wood, broke ground that hadn't wanted breaking. Her hands had calluses where Loretta Pruitt had lace gloves. She'd come to town today only because the social meant trade, a chance to sell preserves, maybe buy seed for the fall planting before the frost turned the ground to iron. She hadn't asked for pity and she hadn't asked to be looked at, but the town square in Prescott had a way of finding a person's rawest wound and pressing on it, slow and deliberate, like a boy testing how far a beetle could be pushed before it stopped moving. "Get on home, Miss Whitfield," said Sheriff Cobb, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Founder's social's no place for, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. That was when the crowd's laughter caught in its throat, because a rider had come down Main Street at a pace nobody used unless something mattered, and the horse beneath him was the kind of animal that made grown ranchers go quiet. 17 hands, black as a gun barrel, moving like it knew exactly what it was worth. Everyone in Prescott knew who rode a horse like that. Reese Calder had left this town 9 years ago with nothing but a saddle and a grudge, and he'd come back 4 months ago owning half the grazing land from here to the Brazos, plus the bank that held half the mortgages in the county, including, though nobody dared say it aloud, the note on the Pruitt place. He swung down before the horse had fully stopped, which was either recklessness or the kind of confidence that came from never once landing wrong, and he crossed the square in a stride that made the crowd part like water around a stone. He didn't look at Loretta Pruitt. He didn't look at the sheriff. He walked straight to Mercy and took off his own coat. Good wool, tailored, worth more than her family had earned in the last 2 years combined, and settled it over her shoulders before she could so much as flinch away. "Miss Whitfield," he said, low enough that it was almost private, though every soul in that square heard it anyway. "I believe you dropped this." She hadn't dropped anything. They both knew it. But something passed between them in that moment. Something that made Loretta Pruitt's smile curdle and the sheriff suddenly find his boots very interesting. "Mr. Calder," Mercy and said carefully, "I don't need rescuing." "No," he agreed, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't pity at all, something closer to recognition, like a man looking at a scar and knowing exactly how it was earned. "But you deserve better than a town that laughs at a torn dress and forgets who tore it." The square had gone silent enough to hear the wind move through the mesquite. "What do you mean, forgets who tore it?" the sheriff asked, and his voice had lost its lazy edge. Reese Calder turned, slow, and let his gaze move over the crowd like a man counting cattle he intended to cull. "I mean," he said, "that dress didn't tear itself. And I intend to find out whose hand did the tearing before this day is through." The crowd's murmur turned to something uneasy, something that smelled like guilt looking for a place to hide. Somewhere behind Loretta Pruitt, her brother Wade shifted his weight and looked, for one unguarded second, like a man remembering a shove he'd delivered in the crush of the crowd not 5 minutes before. A shove nobody was supposed to have seen. Mercy and felt the weight of the coat on her shoulders, warm from his body, and felt something else too. The old, familiar instinct to disappear, to make herself small enough that Prescott would forget she existed at all. But Reese Calder wasn't looking at her like a woman who should disappear. He was looking at her like a woman worth defending, and worse, like a man who intended to do exactly that whether she wanted it or not. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I never said I was paying a debt," he answered. "I said I was correcting an injustice. There's a difference, Miss Whitfield, and I think a woman who's survived what you've survived would know it better than most." Behind them, Wade Pruitt turned to leave, moving fast enough to draw attention. and Reese Calder's voice cracked across the square like a rifle shot. "Wade Pruitt, don't you walk away from what your hands did." The square held its breath. Whatever Prescott thought it knew about the widow's daughter and the millionaire who'd come home with a fortune and an old score to settle, it was about to learn there was a great deal more to both stories than anyone in that crowd had bargained for. Wade Pruitt stopped mid-stride, and when he turned back around, his face had the particular pallor of a man who thought he'd gotten away with something. "I don't know what you're talking about, Calder," he said, though his eyes wouldn't hold steady. "I watched you," Reese said, elbow to her shoulder, hard enough to catch the seam. "You did it because she was standing too close to your sister's new dress order, and you wanted her gone before she embarrassed Loretta by existing next to her." He let that sit in the square's stunned quiet. "I'd call that cowardice, but I expect you'd call it manners." Mercy Ann's hand tightened on the lapel of the borrowed coat. She hadn't seen Wade's elbow. She'd only felt the tear, sudden and humiliating, and assumed the fault was her own worn stitching, same as she assumed most things in Prescott were somehow her own fault, because that was easier than accusing men who owned half the county of small cruelties. "This isn't your business, Calder," Wade said, some of his nerve returning now that the shock had passed. "The Whitfield girl's dress is her own concern." "It became my business," Reese said, "the moment I decided this town wasn't going to keep treating decent people like they were something to be swept off the boardwalk." Here was the moment Mercy Ann had feared since the coat first settled on her shoulders. The moment where a rich man's rescue turned into a rich man's ownership, where gratitude was expected to bend into obedience. She'd seen it before, watched women in Prescott get helped by men whose help came with invisible strings sewn tighter than any dress seam. "Mr. Calder," she said, straightening despite the ache in her shoulders from a morning of hauling water, "I'm grateful for the coat. I'll return it directly, but I won't be made into your cause. I've managed 9 years without a rescuer and I'll manage 9 more. For a moment something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the particular respect a man reserves for someone who refuses to be handled. "I'm not offering to be your rescuer, Miss Whitfield," he said. "I'm offering to be a witness to the truth, which this town has had precious little use for since I left it." "And what do you get from that?" "Nothing," he said. "That's rather the point." She studied him the way she'd learned to study weather, looking for what was coming, not what was being said. There was a tightness around his eyes that spoke of old grief, and a way he stood with his weight balanced like a man who'd learned, somewhere, never to be caught flat-footed. "You left here with nothing," she said slowly, "and now you're worth more than the whole county. Men don't do that by being soft on people who wrong them. So why spend that hardness defending a stranger's torn dress?" He was quiet a moment. The crowd, sensing something private in the exchange, had the decency, or the greed for gossip, to lean in and pretend they weren't listening. "Because I remember what it is to be laughed at in this square," Reese said finally. "My father drank away our claim before I was 12. I stood right about where you're standing now, in clothes that didn't fit, while half this town decided I was trash before I'd had the chance to prove otherwise. Nobody stepped forward for me." His jaw worked once, tight. "I don't intend to watch it happen twice and do nothing." It landed harder than she expected, that admission, not because it excused him from wanting something, but because it explained him without asking for pity in return. She recognized that particular pride, the kind that would rather bleed quietly than admit a wound existed. "Wade," Sheriff Cobb said slowly, clearly recalculating which side of this argument held the county's money. "Did you shove Miss Whitfield?" Wade's mouth opened and closed. Loretta stepped in front of her brother like a woman shielding livestock. "This is absurd. Are we really going to take the word of a saddle tramp turned banker over a Pruitt? You might want to check your family's note before you finish that sentence," Reese said mildly. "I hold it, and I don't take kindly to my debtors calling honest testimony absurd." The threat was quiet, almost gentle in its delivery, but it landed with the weight of a dropped anvil. Loretta's face went the color of old ash. Mercy Ann felt the ground shifting beneath the whole town's careful arrangement of who mattered and who didn't, and some old, bruised part of her wanted to enjoy it. But she'd learned the hard way that watching powerful men rearrange a town's hierarchy rarely benefited the people at the bottom of it, no matter which direction the rearranging went. "Mr. Calder," she said, Threatening the Pruitt's mortgage doesn't mend my dress or feed my family. If you want to do something useful, don't make an enemy of half this town on my account. Let me handle Wade Pruitt in my own way. And what way is that? I intend to tell the truth about what he did. Loud enough that this town can't pretend it didn't hear, and then I intend to go home and finish my chores, because frost is coming and my corn isn't in yet. She met his eyes steady. I don't need a millionaire's war. I need my dignity handed back without a price tag on it. Something shifted in his expression, respect, unmistakable this time. Fair enough, he said. Then I'll simply stand here while you say it, and make certain nobody interrupts. She turned to the square, chin lifted, torn shoulder and all, and told them exactly what had happened, plain and unembellished, while 300 pairs of eyes that had been laughing minutes before now had nowhere comfortable to look. By the time she finished, the wind had picked up, carrying the first cold edge of the season, and somewhere at the square's border, a rider Mercy and didn't recognize sat watching from beneath his hat brim, watching Reese Calder with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much trouble he was worth. The rider's name, Mercy and would learn soon enough, was Silas Grote, and he worked for the one man in the county who resented Reese Calder's return more than any Pruitt ever could, Ezra Voss, who'd bought up half of Prescott's grazing rights while Reese was away making his fortune, and who'd assumed, wrongly, that the empire he'd built would go unchallenged forever. Grote didn't approach until the crowd had thinned, until Mercy and had gathered her preserve jars and started for the wagon she'd borrowed from a neighbor. Reese's coat still around her shoulders because he'd refused, gently, to take it back until she reached home. Calder, Grote said, positioning his horse to block the road out of town. Mr. Voss wants a word. Mr. Voss knows where my office is, Reese said, stepping between the horse and Mercy and's wagon without seeming to make a decision about it at all. The kind of instinct a man only had if protecting people had become a habit, not a performance. He wants the word here, Grote said. Says it concerns the widow's girl. Mercy and felt her stomach drop, because she knew exactly what business Ezra Voss could have with her family's claim. It bordered his land on the north side, and he'd been trying to force her mother off it for 2 years before the fever took the decision out of everyone's hands. My claim isn't for sale, she said before Reese could answer for her. Grote's smile was thin as a knife's edge. Wasn't a question of selling, ma'am. Mr. Voss holds paper on your late mother's debts. Says the note's coming due, and if it ain't paid by the first frost, the land reverts to him. Full legal. That's a lie, Mercy and said, though something cold moved through her, because she didn't actually know. Her mother had kept the family's finances close, protective, right up until the fever stole her ability to explain anything at all. I checked the courthouse records before I called a Voss man a liar, Grote said. Won't take but an hour. Reese's hand moved, slow and deliberate, to rest near the pommel of his saddle. Not a threat exactly, but a readiness that made Grote's horse shift uneasily. I'll ride with her to the courthouse myself, Reese said. And if Voss thinks he can steal a widow's land through paper tricks while I'm holding half this county's actual mortgages, he's about to discover exactly how small his empire really is. That a threat, Calder? It's a fact, Reese said. Facts don't need to be threats to matter. Grote wheeled his horse and rode off toward the Voss ranch at a gallop that kicked dust into the fading light, and Mercy and felt the day's earlier humiliation curdle into something far more dangerous. Fear, real and immediate, for the only thing her mother had left her. They reached the courthouse before it closed, and the clerk, a nervous, thin man named Perkins who clearly wanted no part of whatever war was brewing between the county's 2 richest men, confirmed what Grote had claimed. There was a note, forged or real, Mercy and couldn't yet tell, bearing her mother's signature and a debt figure that made her knees go weak. Due at first frost. 3 days from now. This isn't my mother's signature, she said, staring at the paper. Look at the W. My mother never closed her W's like that. Reese leaned over the document and something in his posture went very still, the stillness of a man who'd learned, in 9 hard years of building an empire from nothing, exactly what a forged signature looked like because he'd seen enough real ones to know the difference. She's right, he said to Perkins. This is a forgery. A clumsy one. I only file what's brought to me, Perkins said, hands raised. Mr. Voss's lawyer filed it 2 months back. All proper, notarized and everything. Notarized by whom? Perkins checked. Judge Harmon. Reese's jaw tightened in a way Mercy and was beginning to recognize as his particular flavor of fury. Quiet, controlled, and far more dangerous for its restraint. Judge Harmon owes me $11,000 on a loan I could call due tomorrow morning, he said. I imagine his memory of that notarization is about to become considerably less certain. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a healing bruise, matching Mercy Ann's dress, and the wind carried the first true bite of the season. 3 days until frost. 3 days until a stranger's forged signature could strip away the only home she had left, unless a millionaire's leverage and a widow's daughter's stubbornness proved to be enough. Why are you doing this? She asked him again, on the ride back toward her claim, the wagon creaking beneath them both. Really doing this? Not the coat. Not the square. This. Fighting Voss over paper that could cost you nothing to ignore. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because Ezra Voss bought my father's whiskey debts 20 years ago and used them to run us off our claim the same way he's trying to run you off yours. My mother died 6 months later in a rented room in Waco, and I was 12 years old and helpless to stop any of it. His hands tightened on the reins. I am not 12 years old anymore, Miss Whitfield, and I am done watching Ezra Voss take what belongs to people who can't fight back. The wagon rattled over the last rise before her claim came into view. The small cabin, the split-rail fence her father built before he died, the corn standing gold and unharvested in the last light. And beyond it, unmistakable even at this distance, 3 riders sat their horses at the property line, watching, waiting, the way wolves wait at the edge of firelight for the fire to die down. Reese didn't slow the wagon. If anything, he urged the team faster, and Mercy Ann understood without being told that whatever came next, he intended to be standing beside her when it arrived. The 3 riders didn't approach the cabin. They simply watched, motionless, until the wagon rolled to a stop in the yard. And then the lead rider tipped his hat with mock courtesy and turned his horse back toward Voss land without a word spoken. It wasn't an attack. It was a message. We know where you live, and we are not finished. Inside, by lamplight, Mercy Ann finally let her hands shake. She hadn't allowed herself to shake in the square, hadn't allowed it at the courthouse, but here, in the cabin her mother had died in, with the forged note's threat hanging over 3 days' time, the fear she'd been holding at bay finally found room to move through her. I'm sorry, she said, embarrassed, pressing her palms flat against the table to still them. I don't usually. You don't have to apologize for being afraid, Reese said, settling into the chair across from her without being invited, which should have irritated her and somehow didn't. Fear's not weakness. It's just the body telling the truth the mouth's too proud to say. She almost laughed, startled by the plainness of it. That's a strange kind of comfort, Mr. Calder. It's the only kind I've got. I was never taught the soft words. Only the hard ones that turned out to be useful. She studied him in the lamplight, the fine wool of his shirt collar, incongruous against the cabin's rough-hewn table, the calluses on his hands that no fortune had managed to erase, proof that whatever he'd built it with the same labor she understood in her own bones. It struck her, not for the first time that day, that Reese Calder was a stranger wearing wealth like borrowed clothes, still carrying the shape of the boy who'd once had nothing. Tell me about your mother, she said, surprising herself with the question. The one Voss's debts took from you. Something crossed his face, old grief carefully managed, the kind that never fully closed. Her name was, and he said, she used to sing while she worked, even after we lost everything. Especially after. I used to think it was foolishness, singing over nothing, but I understand it now. It wasn't about having something to sing about. It was about refusing to let the silence win. Mercy Ann's throat tightened, thinking of her own mother's hands moving over the same worn Bible every evening, murmuring prayers into a cabin that had precious little to be grateful for and was grateful anyway. She rose and went to the small trunk beside her bed, the one piece of furniture that had survived every hardship the Whitfield family had endured, and drew out a folded square of blue cloth, a scrap of the same calico as her torn dress, kept from when her mother first sewed it, years before the fever, years before any of this. My mother made this dress the year my father died, she said, sitting back down, turning the scrap over in her scarred fingers. She said blue was the color of surviving weather, because the sky always turns blue again after a storm, no matter how bad the storm was. I've worn this dress to every hard day since, like it was armor. She looked up at him. I know it's foolish. A dress can't actually protect anyone. It's not foolish, he said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that surprised them both. I understand exactly what you mean. I carry my father's pocket watch, even though it never once told accurate time even when he was alive. It's not about what the thing does. It's about what it remembers for you when you don't have the strength to remember it yourself. Something passed between them then. Not the careful distance of stranger and rescuer, but something closer to recognition. Two people who had both learned, the hard way, how to survive a world that kept trying to strip them down to nothing. I don't want you to fight Voss just because you're angry at what he did to your family, Mercy and said quietly. I want you to help me because it's right, not because I've become a way for you to settle an old score. Both things can be true, Reese said. I won't pretend Voss doesn't deserve to lose something after everything he's taken. But that's not why I stopped my horse in that square today, Miss Whitfield. I stopped because a woman was being humiliated for surviving hardships that weren't her fault, and something in me refused to ride past it. He paused. The old score is mine to settle. Your dignity was never mine to use for that purpose, and I won't let it become that, whatever happens with Voss. She believed him. It surprised her, how completely she believed him. This stranger who'd walked into her ruined afternoon with a coat and a fortune and an old grief that matched the shape of her own. 3 days, she said. That's not much time to prove a forged signature and stop a man like Voss. It's enough time, Reese said, if we spend every hour of it well. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that the offer was clear without demanding anything. I intend to spend mine helping you keep this land, Miss Whitfield. Not as a rescuer. As someone who understands exactly what it costs to lose everything, and refuses to watch it happen to someone else while he has the power to stop it. Outside, the wind had risen, carrying the first true cold of the season across the unharvested corn, and somewhere beyond the property line, Ezra Voss's men were riding back toward a ranch house where a man who'd built his fortune on other people's ruin was about to discover that Prescott's newest son had returned home with considerably more than money. He'd returned with a debt of his own to settle, and a widow's daughter who'd just become far more than a stranger's cause. The 3 days passed in a blur of courthouse visits, telegraph wires to Austin, and a night Reese spent going through 11 years of correspondence he'd kept from his own family's ruin. Searching for the same forger's hand he suspected had drafted the note against Mercy Ann's claim. He found it on the second night, a letter Ezra Voss had sent his father 20 years before, the same clumsy, closed W, the same forger's flourish on the capital letters. It wasn't proof enough for a courtroom, but it was proof enough for a confrontation, and Reese Calder had never much cared for courtrooms when a direct confrontation would serve faster. They rode to the Voss ranch on the morning of the third day, frost silvering the grass beneath the horses' hooves, Mercy and in a mended dress. Her own hands had done the mending, careful stitches over the torn shoulder, because she'd refused to let anyone else do it, refused to let the tear be erased instead of honored. Ezra Voss received them on his porch with the particular smugness of a man who believed his paper had already won. He was older than Mercy and expected, silver-haired and soft-handed, with none of the physical toughness his empire's cruelty suggested he ought to have. Calder, Voss said, and the Whitfield girl. Come to beg for an extension? Come to return this, Reese said, and dropped the forged note on the porch rail between them, alongside the 20-year-old letter with its matching, clumsy signature. Your notary's memory failed him last night, Voss. Judge Harmon signed an affidavit stating he never notarized this document. And your forger's hand is the same one that stole my family's claim 2 decades ago. I'd say that's a pattern a jury would find interesting, wouldn't you? Voss's smugness cracked, just slightly, at the edges. You have no proof of forgery. A judge's memory, conveniently changed, along with a bank examiner I've already summoned from Austin, Reese continued, unhurried, who specializes in exactly this kind of fraud, and who I suspect will find rather more than one forged note once he starts looking through your ledgers. I hold enough paper on this county to make that examination very thorough, and very public, unless we settle this a simpler way. And what way is that? Voss's voice had lost its silk. You release any claim on the Whitfield land, in writing today. You compensate Miss Whitfield for 2 years of harassment regarding a debt that never existed. And you never set foot on her property line again. Reese's voice hadn't risen once, but there was something underneath it now that made even a man like Voss go still. In exchange, I don't ride to Austin myself and spend the considerable resources I now command making certain every debt you've ever forged unravels at once. Your choice, Voss, but choose quickly. I find my patience for men who steal from widows grows thinner with every year I have the power to stop them. The silence stretched long enough that Mercy, and heard her own heartbeat, felt the cold morning air settle into her lungs like held breath finally released. Then Voss, calculating the arithmetic of his own ruin against the cost of surrender, called for his lawyer and his pen. By noon, the papers were signed. By evening, word had spread through Prescott the way word always spread. Fast, hungry, reshaping in an afternoon what the town had spent years believing about who deserved respect and who didn't. Loretta Pruitt, Mercy, and heard later, had taken to crossing the street rather than face the widow's daughter she'd once laughed at in the square. But it was the quiet moment after, not the town's reshuffled opinions, that Mercy and carried with her longest. Reese rode back to the Whitfield claim at sunset, the corn finally harvested, the frost held at bay one more season, and found her sitting on the porch steps in the mended blue dress, watching the sky do exactly what her mother always promised it would, turning blue again after the storm. "It's done," he said, settling beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "The land is yours, clear and permanent. Voss won't trouble you again." "I know," she said. "I heard the whole town already knows too. Does that trouble you?" She considered it, turning the question over the way she turned over stones in the field, checking for what lay beneath. "No," she said finally. "For 9 years I let this town decide what I was worth by how torn my dress looked. I think I'm finished doing that." She looked at him, steady. "Thank you, Reese. Not for the coat. Not even for Voss. For seeing me as someone worth defending, instead of someone worth pitying." "There was never any pity in it," he said quietly. "Only recognition. I saw a woman standing in the wreckage of a hard life, refusing to let it define her as small. I know that particular kind of strength because I spent 9 years building a fortune out of exactly the same refusal." He paused, something uncertain crossing his face for the first time since she'd met him. "I don't know what happens next, Miss Whitfield. I only know I'm not interested in the coat going back to me at the end of this." She laughed. A real laugh, the first one Prescott had heard from her in longer than she could remember, and pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, blue calico beneath fine dark wool, 2 kinds of survival wrapped into one. "Then I suppose you'd better plan on visiting the corn again next season," she said, "because I intend to keep it." He smiled, and it changed his whole face, stripped away the hardness the county had come to expect of him, revealing something younger and less certain and entirely genuine. "I intend to," he said, "for as many seasons as you'll have me." Years later, the people of Prescott would tell the story differently depending on who was doing the telling. Some called it the day the millionaire cowboy humbled the Pruitts. Others called it the day Ezra Voss's empire began its long collapse. But Mercy and Whitfield, when she told it to her own daughter decades on, always told it the same simple way. That the town laughed at a torn dress once and never again, and that some men rescue you from your circumstances, but the rare ones only ever remind you that you were never as small as the world tried to make you believe. The corn came in gold every autumn after that, right up to the tree line where a blacksmith's forge stood beside a ranch house bearing 2 names carved into the beam above the door, and travelers who passed that way would sometimes ask about the carving, and the answer they got depended only on how long they were willing to stay and listen.